Sorry guys, I'm gonna get started in a second. I'm waiting for all of the things to open. So then once we get started, I don't have to wait for things to open again, so I can just switch in between everything. So just a moment. I haven't plugged in yet.
Well, I know, but the TV shut itself down.
Oh, okay. Oh, because, yeah, I like when TVs do that, actually. Question, is there, oh, there's water. It's like, bad, real bad.
Don't wait too long to plug it in this time.
That'll work. All right. Okay. Testing. Can you guys hear me back there? Is that good? Sort of. Oh, let me see. Let me reposition. Better? No better? Hold on. Let me see. Let me see if I can position this in a. I'll just like put it around my ear. Is this any better? I'll just hold it like this the whole time. Is there the little? Yeah, I'll do the headset would probably be better because it's not picking up too well. You guys can't hear that really, can you? That needs to be like right here. Where did the other one go? Just have like.
I'll track that down while you start.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do the self mic check. Just hold it.
I don't know.
That's fine. Now I can do the ShamWow. There we go. Testing. Is it on? Okay. Hold on. Test. Is that better back there? Yeah. All right. Now I need to plug in.
Where'd my HDMI go? You lost it already?
Yeah, I did. Oh, it's in my lap. I didn't bring IT today. All right, everyone. How's everyone doing? You guys hear me back there? We're good? Everyone's good? All right, I'm Matt Kanai. I'm creative and art director on Hanako Soul of the Samurai for Impact Games. I'm also a level designer and senior 3D artist at Hi-Res Studios. First off, I'll show you guys this teaser to show you some art, and then we'll go over some principles and do it workshop style. So here's this, if it plays with all of the things open. Nope, doesn't want to play. All right. Hold on. Medium settings. Can you play a lower one? I do have a lower res version on here. When I find it. Boop, 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 boop. Wait for it. I'll wait for it. I could do my ShamWow pitch right now. Do you like looking at windows? Yeah, the smaller. Is there audio? Nope, the audio's on. Alright, so there is a short teaser from our game Hanako, Soul of the Samurai, and I want to use that as a base. I gotta find the frame that I want though. There we go, there's a good shot. So when I'm starting to work on environments and once our level designer has our level blocked out, then I could go and there's a basic shape and I'll go, alright, here's all this negative space, all this non-play space, how do I want to fill that in? And for large multiplayer games, or since I'm the only artist on the project, I have to be very, very efficient with how I work. So I might have a very limited amount of assets that I can go into. Something that I learned really early on, and I think I spent the first year of my career doing nothing but these types of things, and that was rocks and what we call in the industry, or at least at Hi-Res, and I still call that God cliffs. Basically, that's a 360-degree mesh that you make it look a little bit different on each side, and you can just reuse the crap out of it. Like this scene, pretty much everything in the background is almost one mesh except for the mountain that was kind of specific. Question for you guys. How many of you guys are hopeful environment artists or already environment artists or have interest in becoming one? All right, that's pretty good, what would you say, because I want this to be the most useful information for you guys. What are you guys most interested in learning or taking away from this? Is there something like texturing, or how do I ZBrush certain things? How can I get better at a certain topic? So, I mean, just yell it out. ZBrush?
Just laying out maps.
Laying out maps. Okay.
How to reuse assets without making it look like you're reusing assets, or at least, you know, if they notice that you're reusing assets, it's not well into the game like, wow, I have seen that rock before, you know, but it's, you know, like they're almost at the end and they just then notice it.
Okay.
Efficient workflows.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That sounds sort of like what I was going to do. It's perfect. So I work in kind of a reverse pipeline for, I'll start with using a God cliff because that's the most used. It has the most bang for the buck. And that's a principle one of my mentors taught me really early was, how can you get the most out of the least? And then at the same time, to your point, how can you make that worse? I'm like, oh, there's one rock that they made this whole level out of. I've seen it before. I go, let me take a nap until they put more rocks in. So I actually start in ZBrush, and let me actually import this. Sorry, I'm bad at opening files. So this is kind of the end result, and I'll go over a little bit, just some basic techniques for this. Usually for organic stuff, because ZBrush, if you're using 4R6, it has a feature called Z-Remesher, and basically you can do a crazy, amazing sculpt, and then in a single click, basically get a game-ready mesh, and just put that in the game engine after you UV it, and that is fantastic. So to get this kind of shape, usually start with a sphere, and Dynamesh is another feature that, first off, how many of you guys have used ZBrush before? And how, okay, pretty good. How many have no idea what ZBrush is? Or, okay, it's about even. So ZBrush is it's a 3D sculpting software, and basically for games, how it's used typically is you make your model for your game, and it's usually a low poly mesh that the game engine can handle, so maybe a couple thousand triangles or quads. And then you take that into ZBrush, and you can divide it into a super millions and millions of polygons, and what that allows you to do is sculpt on it like clay. And then when you're done with that, you can transfer that detail down to textures, and I'll explain that a little bit later. So one of the amazing features that ZBrush added more recently was, not having dual monitors so different. There we go, there's my grid. Is before you would sculpt and your mesh could get extremely, just my move brush, there we go. You see how these quads are getting stretched out. Something amazing that ZBrush added was the ability to just immediately re-topologize that. And what that means is it just fills in the gaps and makes it all even and nicely spaced so you can continue sculpting. And what this did is for like character artists, they could start just making their mesh in ZBrush without having, and classically, you'd have to make your mesh in 3D Max or Maya, have your block out T-pose character, and then bring them into ZBrush with a lot of the basics taken care of. Here, you can just start. And it's kind of the same thing for environment art doing organic shapes. So you have your poly count up here, and I suggest for organic things starting kind of low, and you cover the big things and you work your way in. And some of this is dictated by art style. So if you're working on a Call of Duty realistic game, you're going to have much more granular small detail. Or if you're working on, like in the trailer, you see it's a kind of a comic book stylized style, and you can get away with more broad strokes, and you don't have to focus so much on every little crack and every detail. So for God Cliffs, really I had to start pulling out shapes, and it's a pretty simple process. I'm not going to make the whole thing, but I'll do like a little portion. And I just get kind of a rough rocky shape out of this sphere. And you can either, sometimes if you're lucky enough to have a concept artist on like an indie project that can draw out like maybe how this should look, then you can work with that. But a lot of times, like Connor's my level designer on Hanako, and he's also the best reference gatherer of all time. So when he's blocking out a level, and it kind of bottlenecks because the map's just waiting for art for long periods of time. So I'll ask him like, hey, here's an asset list, can you gather me reference? Usually we talk about the mood ahead of time, and if you guys have done mood boards in college, that's a really useful thing. It's kind of just gathering reference for what the whole mood of your level is. So it's finding as many images online as you can. So for the scene in the teaser, for example, that's based on Mount Yari in Japan, it's an actual location, so we just got as many photographs of Mount Yari as we could, and then just started blocking from there. So I'll work on getting a basic shape kind of like this. And the thing about ZBrush, especially, I really struggled with this because I'm terrible at drawing, and that's why I need computers to make me look like I'm good at it, is that for a long period of time on your sculpts, they just don't look very good. But you have to keep going with it, and the best advice I got was basically to keep sculpting. Don't crumple it up and start over. Just keep sculpting and developing and working your way in, and eventually, see how much time I have. Eventually you'll kind of reach the ideal point, and you'll overcome that hump, because there's quite a learning curve in this program because the interface is insane. You have to perform a rain dance to do simple things like zoom. So once you get a basic shape, there's just a ton of brushes here, and I always recommend just playing around with them, see what they do. And a lot of times you'll learn some really crazy things. Each brush kind of has its own properties. So after you get your basic shape, you can, basically I call it redynameshing. You can kind of click drag, and that'll kind of reset your geometry and give you an even canvas again with the shape that you already created. So you can keep pulling out crazy shapes. You want to make like crazy tubes or tentacles or whatever. If you have like a fantasy world where you're making a tree that has like kind of crazy wavy things, that's very nice to have. For rocks though, I almost sculpt all rocks the same way, whether it's a cliff or a rock. I mean, cliffs tend to have the same properties, but there's more horizontal banding. So for a cliff like this, I'll focus on just one side. So there's a brush called Clay Buildup in ZBrush that gives you just kind of a nice basic shape. And this, don't focus too much on the detail yet. You just want to get like really rough shapes. Kind of, if you have a reference image, you can kind of see you'll see like clip pieces where there's parts that are jutting out or parts that are recessing, and you can kind of get those shapes and start to build. And then once you get to this point, I'm staying at still a pretty low resolution, 90,000 tries. It's fairly low. Once you get to a point where, like, okay, I have good basic shapes, now I want it to have really good rocky detail. Now you can drag this slider up. Don't go too crazy with it, though, unless you have an amazing computer. And then do whatever you want. Start at high resolution if you want. So I'll wait for, this is exactly why I say be careful with the slider, because it takes a while the higher you go, because it has to process everything. So while this is doing its thing, is anyone completely lost or have any questions so far? I'll kind of informally take questions as I go if anyone's utterly confused. If everyone's good, then when it does its thing.
You do get questions.
Okay. Oh no. Oh no. Up. The spinny of death. Hold on. All right. That's fine. Open ZBrush again. And I'll go back to sculpting in a second, but basically I'll touch on this while it's reopening. So the next step is basically you get, this is the outcome without the textures on it. So you'll get something like this. And this is the next step of the workflow. So you start in ZBrush, and this is mostly for organic. So for architecture and buildings, I always recommend starting in Max or Maya first, because you have primitive shapes that you can build your infrastructure, and then you can take it into ZBrush to handle fine detail. And then either way, you're coming back to Max or Maya after to do UV mapping. And that's the process of, you're cutting your mesh and then you're laying it flat so you can paint on it in Photoshop. And those look like, wait for it. They look crazy, but it looks like this. And basically, if you see the green line, that's where I made my cut. So it's kind of like, if you have this, you just make a cut down the middle, and then that allows you to wrap it flat, and you can kind of see where the edge is. And it shows you here, so when you're painting your textures, you know where your edges are, so you can paint. And there's basically, if you're painting over seams, if the things don't match up, then you'll get like a hard line where the detail doesn't quite line up, and it looks pretty bad in general. But sometimes you can't avoid that. ZBrush does not want to reopen. Until now. It was abnormally terminated. So go back to this really quick. I won't go crazy this time with resolution. I'm going to do this again really quick. All right, good enough for me. So we have weird smooth cliff. And I'll sculpt my rough details again. And this is another thing, you know you're going to be reusing this a whole bunch. So if you look at your details on one side as you're working on the others, you're going to want to make it look fairly different and maybe have some key details that make it have a unique appearance on one side, but then it's more general on another. So if you have sections in your level where you're like, okay, I want more detail here because it's directing the player up a hill to the next spot, and you can kind of sculpt around that. All right, more modest, that'll work. So from there, there's an awesome brush called Trim Dynamic when I find it. in this giant list. I'm learning. I don't like hotkeys in ZBrush for some reason. So trim dynamic basically starts to give you a rocky feel as you're sculpting, and you can start hitting angles. And then it starts to look a little more rock-like. And this is the same exact principle if you're sculpting small rocks. And the way that I like to teach ZBrush sculpting and environmental workflow is by material types. So I'll kind of show, like, here's how you would sculpt anything wooden or anything metallic or rocky. Since rocks are so common, especially for an outdoor game like this, I usually start with this because it's kind of the easiest one to work with and the most used, so bang for your buck again. So let me change this so you guys can see more depth. There you go, it's a little bit better. And then at this point you can do, this is kind of starting to get your base rock shape. And from there, I'll do a second pass with about half the size of the brush as before and kind of get a smaller, more granular. And this is also dictated by your art direction, so you can keep going down until you get the ideal appearance. And then I just bounce back and forth between giving that kind of shape build up and then going back and smoothing it out with a smaller and smaller brush each time. I'll do this very quickly so we can get through all of the steps. Then if you're, so this isn't very good, but it's just really quick. The next thing that I'll do, and this is something that a character artist actually showed me that's awesome. The crumple brush is really great for getting like horizontal or vertical bands, and you can kind of wiggle your mesh and wiggle that detail into it. And this is it's a really powerful brush, so a technique you can use if it looks crazy with how this kind of does is you can have layers in ZBrush that have an intensity slider. So you can sculpt really crazily and then scale it back after you're already done. And it's a really nice non-destructive tool. I don't know what makes noise every time I press that. So you can kind of shake your horizontal bands into this. You can do vertical too if you want to get a little more rock. So now it's starting to look quite rocky. And this is where a lot of the fine detail comes from the crumple brush, and it's fantastic for organic stuff. And then if I'm happy with that, I can turn off record, and you can see it morphs the intensity. I can actually go the other direction too for whatever reason if you wanted to. And for these kind of things, it's not, I don't like step by step, here's how you make rocks every time. Look at the principles behind this and look at how can I apply this to any given art piece. Because you could do this for anything. Layers exist for anything you want to use them for. So when you're done with this, you can just bake it into the mesh when you're happy with it. I'll show you another technique as well, is you can bring in alphas from textures or images and kind of stamp them on your mesh. And this is really great if you have like an architecture piece that has like a medallion or a logo or whatnot for if you're building a store or something where you can just stamp it wherever you want. So I advise building a library of stencils and alphas, and it's just black and white images that basically white gives you height and black gives you recess, or it's neutral depending on if it's just flat like this. So I'll show you an example of stencil. So there's a brush called a layer that allows you just to have an even, flat kind of plateaued profile for your shapes. And you can change your brush to drag, and basically that lets you just drag in shapes, and this isn't very intense. And a lot of this is bound on your resolution, so the higher resolution you get, the more detail you get. So you see this is really fuzzy, that means I probably need a little more resolution. I'll try to go to a flat surface. So you can just click drag in shapes. And if you want more clarity from this, you just increase your resolution from the Dynamesh slider, so you get something like this. But this is also extremely useful for loading in an alpha of just, you can load in tileable textures. So I have this rock detail right here, which is fantastic. And I can load that in with drag. And since there's hard edges on this, you can actually modify your alpha once you bring it in. And it has a radial fade, which is great. So it fades it out so you can overlap it more and you don't get the same repeating. And then you can just click drag in the rock detail. Actually, I prefer to do this on a layer too because it gets fairly intense. So if you don't want to spend all the time doing all the fine detail with the 3 brushes, you can kind of just go to a flat surface and start dragging this in. And this is a really easy way to get awesome detail right away. So you can, if you find a texture that has awesome shapes, you can take it into Photoshop, grayscale it, and play with the color to try to get something like this, and immediately just get really fast detail. And this is great. This was kind of a game changer for us because we have so much organic art in our game that I have to be able to make rocks and cliff pieces. You know, I can't spend more than maybe a night or 2 on them. So you can just click drag and get really awesome detail really quickly. And then if it's too intense, you scale it back to an ideal level, and then you're done. So let's assume this is done, and the next step is taking it into 3D Studio. I won't cover UV mapping because it's very specific to your software. Most of you guys probably use Maya. And if you're in school for it, you'll definitely learn how to do that. But once you get that, basically, this would take forever if I did it here, but you bring in your high poly mesh, and there's a technique called projection. And what that does is, since you have millions of polygons or hundreds of thousands of polygons of detail in this mesh, you can't put that in a game by itself. Like an entire map would be the polygon count of this object. Not this one, but because it's slow. But in theory, you're making a fully high poly mesh for your game. It's going to be millions of polygons. So you need to transfer that detail. So when you project, it takes these UVs and it compares your high quality ZBrush mesh to your Maya or Max low poly model, which this is only a couple thousand. So you can just use this wherever you want, and performance isn't so much of a problem. It's a really fluid workflow. Because for character artists, for example, if they're sculpting their character, then they have to take into another software it's called topologize, and they have to kind of trace the character by connecting the dots, and it's kind of shrink wrapping your mesh. And you can do that for environments too. But when you're done with this, I'll show you guys quickly. There's a Z-remesher feature where you can kind of pick a target polygon count. It's like, well, this has to be under 2,000, so I'll drag it down, click Z-remesh, and it runs a little program that's like, oh, well, here's your game mesh. You're welcome. I just saved you like 5 hours. And that's super efficient. And that's great for school projects too, because a lot of times students tend to be really ambitious with their levels, and they have to make, 1,000 things. So first off, you probably should scope and manage and realize, like, how much can I really make in 10 weeks or 15 weeks or whatever. Or for a game, I have a month to make this level. How can I be efficient? Efficiency is really important. So this gives me kind of a low poly mesh that I can use, and the detail's gone, but it gives you the silhouette really is most important for low poly meshes. So you bring that in, you go through the projection technique, and what I do is I use something called ambient occlusion, and these are the results after you project. And this is an ambient occlusion map, and what that is basically, it looks at recesses in your model, and it kind of finds areas that would be naturally shadowed kind of regardless of what happens. So regardless of the lighting scenario, there's just kind of an ambient darkness where light is just going to kind of fall into recesses and nooks. And then this map's the most important for modern games, and this is a normal map. Basically what it does is it compares the angles of your high poly or super high quality mesh, and it transfers them to your low quality mesh. And it's kind of XYZ RGB, so you can see it kind of attaches that to an axis. And for texturing, let me find the PSD for this. God, Cliffy B. So this is my final texture for the mesh, and my workflow for texturing is pretty standard. I have my normal map, and I have my AO, and then I always start with the AO and just call it. And AO maps get multiplied over your mesh in older game engines. In UE4, it's a physically based rendering, and what that does is it splits out your maps a little bit more, and I'll go into that when I actually import this. But there's a channel for it, so you don't have to do this. But the simplest way is I have a library of textures per map. So when I'm designing a level, the art direction is taken into account from the very beginning, and I know, okay, this level is going to have these kind of rocks. They're going to have like a dark rock or like a sandstone or a limestone. You figure that out in advance. Then I gather base textures that are just tileables that look like this, that are just seamless, and this is already stylized for our game, but you can use websites like gametextures.com or CG Textures, and you just find your base reference, and there's usually a pretty affordable or free solutions where you can grab these, and even Google Images sometimes. If you Google like tileable rock texture, you get a whole, hundreds of them to choose from. But I have my base rocks, and why I do that is for unification. If I use a dark rock type on one cliff and then the next one is like a sandstone because I like the way that looked, in your level it's not going to make sense, because the other thing is studying geology and how erosion works and all those things happen. The rocks that are sitting in the level or a boulder have to come from somewhere. They're going to be breaking off of larger mountains or cliffs and falling down into the world. So it's going to be the same rock type. So if a cliff looks one way, the rock should probably be the same color and value range. And you can have variation on a micro level, so you're not looking like, oh, this is just a cliff scaled down into a rock. It still has unique detail, but the general value range is the same. So the simplest way to texture is you have, really I just the first thing I start with is I bring in my layers, and then I just multiply my AO over the top. And that gives me kind of a guideline for where the UVs are, so I know where to paint details. And there's new software like Substance Painter, for instance, where you can just paint like straight on the mesh. And you can play around with blend mode so you can start to get some of that detail. Let's see if I have crazy bump on here. I do. And this technique is something that I do to every texture. And actually, Ben Knapp, you're in here. You taught me this technique. And ever since you taught me that, I do it on every asset I've ever made since. And it's a really easy, error. I think I could probably do this in Photoshop then, a similar setup. So if you have crazy bump, you can load normal maps into it. And from that, you can get a black and white map that gives you kind of it converts this to something you can use to highlight your edges, and this is a really cool technique. Yes, I unfortunately don't have that, but this will work similarly. I'm gonna manipulate to try to get a similar outcome. Yeah, this will work. So you can take your normal map and get kind of an edge map, and if you're familiar with blend modes, you kind of get a feel for this over time. And for some reason, I always go through every blend mode every time I do this just to see which one looks the coolest. So for our game, we have a lot of comic outlines, and we like to do cross contouring similar like a Borderlands or any Telltale game. So just to give it a feel like you're in kind of a comic book or a stylized thing where it makes sense to have some fantasy elements versus realistic. And this works for realistic games too, but you can see that it starts to give you some highlighting for your mesh or some edge contouring. And this also applies on the other side of the spectrum. A lot of times I end up doing both, as you can duplicate this layer and you can take it the other direction and use levels to bring out the highlights instead. So I can go to something like this and maybe bring this down a little bit. And you can set this to screen or color dodge, and that gives you like a nice highlighting on here. I mean, the lighting in your engine is going to handle a lot of this too, because it reads the normal map and uses that to see how light should cast on it. But if you're doing like a mobile game where maybe you don't have normal maps and you want to kind of bake in some lighting, this is a really easy trick for doing that. Crazy Bump gives you a better result, but this is my improv Crazy Bump crashed how to do it another way. And then this texture is for the actual, the cliff that I already had open before. This is the one that we brought in just base textures from to show you how to start. And really at this point, I would consider this done because I can use other textures in the engine to kind of create unique detail. And actually what I'm going to do is I need to find a grass texture or a snow. That works. Moss. Perfect. Perfect. So you have two options. If you know, there's a thing called vertex color that I'll go over in the engine that lets you paint straight in the engine. This is kind of the answer to your earlier point, is how do you make it look more unique? This allows you to paint on every instance of your mesh in your level in the game engine. So you can place rocks and then you can look at, okay, these two rocks are right next to each other, so I want this one to look different. You can go in and just paint moss on it, for instance, and I'll show you how to set that up. It's really easy setup. Or if you don't have that luxury, or really what I end up doing is just pasting. Why is it grayscale? That's weird. Why is it gray? Wait, maybe I didn't copy it right. Hold on. Date modified. Why does Windows set everything up like it's grandma's photo album? Show me the thing I just made. There we go, MySpace. Is it still? There we go. You can just paste it. I'll paste this in just a bunch of times, kind of around the board. Let's say a good thing for integration is if you're going to be shoving a cliff into a terrain, for instance, there's going to be kind of a seam. So a lot of times I'll take my actual ground textures from the level and I'll use that as kind of a detail map to paint around the base of the cliff. So when you put that in the ground, the grass texture that's right there on the ground will naturally fade into the mesh, so it helps with your integration. So you could paste these around and then just collapse and just erase out. Get a nice soft brush, or sometimes there's brush packs you can download that have like a really rough brush style, and then you can just paint out around that edge, and then you can just play with blend modes or opacity and get a look that fits in with the game. I still always go through every single blend mode every time and look at which one. Oh, this looks kind of cool because it's spotty and it's not everywhere. Overlay is usually a pretty good one though. And then if you're doing something like you want paint that's kind of like rubbed off of something, or you just want it to be missing, you can use these in Photoshop to kind of, it looks at the dark and light values under that layer and it starts to fade that out some. So this is a good simple trick if you wanted to do like paint rubbing off of metal, or if you wanted more spotty moss that's not so even in general. And you can have kind of gradients of that as you go. So it goes something like that. So now after that, once you're done with your texture, it's bringing it into the engine. And this is unfortunately the Hanako build didn't work. So this is a base Unreal 4, which will be fine. And the first thing is importing your mesh, and naming conventions is something that's super important in environment art because your level designers are going to be using this, and if you name yourself just arbitrary things, you're going to have a really hard time. So the way that I tend to split things up is by either asset type, like scene, and then the type of asset. So I would call this, like our scene is call this siege level. And then organic is what I usually do for like any rocks or anything like that. I mean, they're not living, they're not organic, but it's describing the shapes. And then from there, you want to be organized. So I usually have a meshes folder. And can you guys see this okay? Is the text too small back there? Can you guys see this? Ish?
Not at all.
I'm sorry. And I have meshes, textures, and materials. That's pretty standard for environment stuff. And you just import stuff where it's supposed to go. So I'm going to import. And I have my source art folders. They usually live somewhere else. Not like Yari Organic is the scene. And I have the same 3 folders: my base art, then my exported meshes, and then my textures. So I'll import God Cliffy B. And you can have it auto-generate collision, which is fantastic. It's not always good, but it's a good start if you just want to get some basics in there. This is actually importing my textures too, which Unreal 4 has some awesome stuff for auto importing. So I'll let it do its thing. And while this is doing its thing, any questions? I hope not. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, have you ever used 3D code yourself?
The question was, have I ever used 3D Coat? I have not personally used 3D Coat. I use Substance Painter instead. It's similar, almost the same exact concept, 3D painting on your mesh, and it has physically based rendering built in, so you can do like your metallic and roughness. You don't have to really like hand paint it, it just generates it. If you guys, for those of you who've never heard of Substance Painter, it's a really awesome program, and if I had more time, I'd actually cover it. But it lets you paint straight on your mesh, and it has a material library already that it basically knows how each material behaves with lighting. So you can say, this section of the mesh is rock, this part's metal, this part's gold, this part's chrome. It'll automatically set it up so it has like the reflections, and it has the sheen on like a wet rock versus a dry one, and it's a really awesome software. So this brought in my mesh, and it already set up a material for me, which was kind of amazing. But if you didn't do that, I'll show you guys the basic material as well. Importing your textures is the same exact process. And you just have to find, again, naming conventions. I use always T_ for everything, and then some descriptor, like guide Cliffy B and normal map. That imports my textures. Normal maps have different settings for game images. For UE4, it automatically detects. And if it doesn't, you just have to set compression settings to normal map settings. And then from there, I will make the material, and I'm going to make a new one. And I'll explain how this works. So this basically, you have your textures, and now it needs to go into a material. And what that does, it handles the way that it shades, the way that it lights. You can set up, there's infinite possibilities within a material, any given material. You could have like water that's flowing, and set up kind of animation or scrolling textures, and it's extremely powerful. Really, that could be like a three-hour panel just on materials. It's quite vast. So I'll start by dragging in the textures I'm going to use. I'm actually going to also import that moss texture that I made earlier. And again, date modified Y. I'll drag that in too. So you have your textures, and they're lined up into channels, and each channel has its own kind of behavior and how it manipulates. And I'll drag this so you can see the preview better. So the first thing is you have your diffuse texture. Well, that's just your color information. Everything that you just painted in Photoshop goes into base color. And you can see from there you have three properties: metallic, specular, and roughness. That determines how reflective or not something is. So that's a scale of 0 to 1, 1 being the most metallic and 0 being not metallic at all. So if I set this to 1, you have mirrored mountain. Usually for organic stuff, it's just set to 0. And then I'll leave this at 1 just to demonstrate a principle really quick. Roughness determines kind of if you're completely 100% mirror at a roughness of 0, and then kind of like a brushed metal at all the way 1. So this is, if I move the lighting, 0 roughness and 1 metallic. That gives you a completely reflective surface. And that's something that's new in Unreal Engine 4 is reflectivity is built into these two features, whereas before you'd have to do like a cube map or do like a reflection image, and it was a much more complicated setup. So for this, I want the rock to have kind of a base sheen, not a lot. So I'll set it to something like 0.7, and from there, the normal map will control a lot of the detail, and you'll see how there was an even sheen before. Now that I have the normal map, you can see that the lighting bounces over the detailed shape, which is really nice. And then what I'll do is I'm going to set up a system so we can paint on the mesh to address doing kind of unique behavior. So LERP is a node that's basically, you have two layers. You have A and B, and then you have an alpha channel, and that determines on black to white how much is shown. So if it's completely white, it'll just show A. If it's completely black, it'll just show B. And that allows you to either overlay different things, or you can use this to paint straight on your mesh. So if I want to configure this, I can put in a vertex color node. And that lets you paint either in red, green, or blue. And basically you're saying, wherever I paint red on this mesh, show the B layer. and you can set this up really complicated, and you can use all three colors. You can say, where I paint red, I want grass. Where I paint blue, I want snow. Where I paint green, I want whatever you want, smiley faces. So actually, I have that backwards. I always get it mixed up. So I'll save that. Have my material. From there, you just need to apply it to your mesh. So this auto applied one, and it created a material from Max, which is kind of cool. I need to apply this material. There's the new one that I made, and there's that. You see it behaves a little bit differently. And then from there, Unreal 4 makes it really easy to place assets. You can just click drag into your level, and there it is. And then what I'll do is I'll put a couple of these in. And this is something where when you're building levels, you can just kind of arrange the mesh where it doesn't look like a copy over and over. And I wish I could touch on world building more, because really that could be another 2-hour panel too. But trying to give you guys an overview of pipeline and then some simple asset placement stuff. So from here, there's a paint tab, and this links up to your material, and I mentioned that I plugged it into that red channel. So I can just grab red, select a mesh, and paint grass if it's working. There we go. So now I'm painting grass straight on the mesh. And this is exactly the solution to breaking up. So I can paint this one this way, and then I could go to the next one and paint a different way. And then this is great because if you might have placed this cliff in a spot where there's not a grass ground texture, maybe it's a snow or something, and then you can maybe just paint snow instead or not paint grass. So each one can be a little bit different. And this is just a really simple setup to do that too. It's just that lerp node with a vertex color controlling it, and you just can come in here and paint. And it's awesome. So that kind of sums up the basics, and then at that point you have a finished asset. So amazingly unplanned, finishing right on time for 10 minutes of questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so if you lerped and you vertex colored, obviously moss would have a different surface property.
Yes.
Can you use those same vertex color in lerp nodes to drive your roughness and metallic as well?
Yes. So since this is all based on channels, I should have stolen one, my bad. Sorry. The question was, since you used vertex color and alert to drive your colors, could you since moss has a different light property or behaves differently than the rock, can you set that up with your roughness and metallic channels to behave how moss would behave versus rock? And really what I end up doing is just copying these nodes, and you can plug them into roughness. I mean, you don't do that because roughness, like I mentioned before, is black to white. If you're using Substance or 3D Code or something like that, you would have roughness. What I do for simplicity's sake is a lot of times I don't have roughness because for efficiency, I don't want a roughness metallic map for every asset in the level because I don't need it. A lot of times I'll use a desaturation node and use that as roughness, and then what I'll do is you can use a linear interpolate, again, a lerp, and what I'll do is I have a range. I know I never want my roughness for the entire asset to ever go under 0, and I don't want it to ever go above 0.7 or whatever. And then I use the texture as the alpha. So I'll put that into roughness. And this isn't a great way for this particularly. This isn't a great use case for moss versus rock, but we'll go with it and see how it turns out. So you see, I have the 0 to 1 range, and it's really crazy. This is where I want to tone it back, so I'll say 0.5. And then it analyzes parts of the mesh. There's no moss in this preview. Let's see what it looks like in the level when I change that. No autosave. Autosave, please. Please autosave. Yeah, does that answer your question? Okay, next question.
Can you mix using the base rendering materials with the more old school, or do you kind of have to decide which you're using?
The question is, can you mix physically based materials with a more old school setup? And the answer is yes, and we do that a lot in our game because we were in UDK before and we moved to UE4 after we had a year's worth of art created. What I ended up doing a lot of times is I used old specular maps in this exact setup. I have my range of roughness and then I use my spec map as the alpha. So kind of the dark areas of the spec will have, I use it for metallic. So if you have, in the old school way, specular map controlled all of that. So if you had white on a spec map, it would be more metallic looking, and if it was dark, it would be less metallic looking. So I would plug a lerp with kind of whatever range you want into metallic, and then your old spec map would become your alpha for that. So you kind of drive metallic that way. And then for roughness, I would do the same thing, and I would either use, sometimes you can use a color channel. So if you have, for example, there's a lot of green in the moss, if you know you want the green to be more significant, you can grab the green node and drive alpha from that. So there's more roughness information being taken from the green areas of your texture. So the moss would pick up more light. Does that answer your question? Any more questions? Yes, sir.
What would be your workflow for doing something that's kind of more hand-painted or cel-shaded type style?
The question is, what would be my workflow for doing something more cel-shaded or more painterly? Our game kind of has transitioned recently into something more painterly, whereas before we had kind of an in-between, part realistic and part stylized, and then we started pushing more towards. I still start with photo reference a lot of times. You can hand paint, and there's no right or wrong way to do that. If you have good digital painting skills, you could just paint from scratch. I don't find that to be particularly efficient. A simple way that I do this is I'll bring in like a really like high detailed rock texture, for instance, and I'll drag this up. Let me see if one of these isn't stylized already. Yeah, this actually is stylized, and this probably is too. But I'll bring in, actually, let me grab a rock texture that's super crazy. Go something like this. Log in to download. I'm just gonna see if I can copy this. Copy image, let's see if that works. Did it work? Did not work. All right, hold on. There's always a way. Snipping tool. Snipping tool. Snipping tool. There we go. I'm not logging in. You can't hold me back, internet. So I'd have something, this is a photo ref, and this is the easy way. I don't actually use this anymore. I used to back in the day. I use one of the artistic filters, and I'll have my base texture. Usually I'll duplicate it, and then I'll do dry brush is a good one to start getting a quick and easy kind of painterly look. And I'll lower that towards, depending on how much detail you want. This isn't great. There's other plugins out there that do such an amazing job of this that I know Telltale uses them to completely just do their stylized look. Then what I'll do is I'll kind of tone this back so I start getting some of the old detail in. And then you can duplicate the base layer again and use something like poster edges is another good one that gives you some more like line-like detail. And then you can tone back from there, and you can either do like a multiply and then just play with opacity till you get that look. And then I mentioned another technique where you get the edge maps from your normal map to kind of get like either black lines going across your edges or white ones. That's a really good technique too. Or you can just hand paint them too.
Right.
Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you know how to dry
Substances
substances in
in like water, or you're talking about dropping like a substance from like a substance painter?
Yeah, like, how does that work in comparison to land use?
So the question is, how does Unreal 4 handle substances, which is kind of a substance painter file or package that contains all of your textures that you just did on a mesh. What I always do is, I haven't found a good way to export just straight. Like you saw when I imported that mesh, it made the material for me. I always export the individual maps. So there was this piece, let me see where the trailer is. Sorry for audio. This gazebo piece was completely textured in Substance. And I just exported the maps and they basically just went into each channel by name. So let me see if I have those. Substance export, yeah, here we go. So I have my normal, my roughness and gloss, which I use as metallic, and my normal map this was all exported straight from Substance. And basically I did this as RNG, and this is, if you're gonna have multiple black and white maps per texture, is super efficient performance saving. It's called RGB packing. And that's basically metallic goes in the red channel, and then roughness goes in the green. So I would plug this into the metallic channel from the material node. So since it's red and green, if I was to import that, I'll just you can plug the red straight into metallic, and that is this node, or this texture or layer, and then green, this would go into roughness. And that's how I handled my export from Substance. Does that answer your question? Okay. We are right about at time. I can take one more question if anyone has one. Yes, sir?
For foliage, do you use SpeedTree or something else?
The question is, for foliage, do you use SpeedTree or do you use something else? We use SpeedTree pretty exclusively. Let me go back to the trailer. All of this stuff is SpeedTree. This hero tree in the center. Let's see. What I did was I sculpted a unique trunk, and you can import that as a frond layer. And it was a really hacky, like I was experimenting. Like, there has to be a way to put a unique trunk in here because it's a hero piece. It's the most important tree in the whole game. So I wanted the trunk to look really nice and have a nice sculpted detail. So it was partially SpeedTree, but since placing T-planes and all of that by hand is a nightmare, and I would never recommend doing that anymore, the trunk is driven uniquely, and then the branches and the leaves and flowers are all driven from SpeedTree. And then for, see these flowers, for instance, I made a mesh in 3D Max that was just kind of, I mapped to an alpha channel all the flowers and the pieces and made like a little mesh, and then I took it into SpeedTree as a planes layer and loaded that, and so I could have a cluster of flowers. Because every instance of foliage is going to have it's going to add to your draw calls and add to your performance. I wanted a cluster of them, so I would have 4 or 5 leaves or 4 or 5 flowers in a cluster and only pay for them once. And to that note, Unreal 4 foliage, what it does is this is all painted grass using the foliage system, and that lets you drag a mesh into a layer, and then you can just paint that mesh everywhere. And what it does is it looks at clusters of it and it combines all those into one single draw. So you have one render cost for maybe 100 instances of grass, which is fantastic for performance. And then you can say, at this distance, fade out the grass. So yeah, if there's nothing else, we'll conclude. I hope you guys learned something today. That wasn't too daunting. But thanks a lot, guys.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Sorry about not getting you the extra hour.
No, it's fine.
Stephanie was using over there.